August 14th, 2023. South Brooklyn, New York. A demolition crew was tearing down a 4-story brick warehouse that had stood on Atlantic Avenue since 1924. The morning was humid. The sky, a pale gray that promised rain but never delivered. Dust hung in the air like a permanent fog, coating the workers' hard hats and safety vests in a fine layer of grime. The building had been condemned 3 years earlier, its windows boarded, its walls tagged with graffiti that no one bothered to remove. For nearly a century, it had served various purposes: a textile storage facility, a furniture depot, and before that, during Prohibition, something far more secretive. Now it was nothing but rubble waiting to happen. The foreman, a 52-year-old man named Robert Castellano, had overseen dozens of demolitions in his 30 years on the job. He knew the rhythm of destruction, the way old buildings surrendered their secrets grudgingly, brick by brick. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his crew would find that morning. The excavator had been clearing debris from the basement level when its operator, a young man named Marcus Williams, felt the bucket strike something solid. Not concrete, not bedrock, something metallic, hollow, that resonated with a strange, muffled echo. Williams cut the engine and climbed down to investigate, his boots crunching on pulverized masonry. What he saw made him step back instinctively, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. Beneath the rubble, partially exposed by the excavator's bucket, was the unmistakable chrome grille of an automobile. It was green, or had been once, now faded to a murky olive under decades of dust and darkness. The car appeared to be entombed in a concrete chamber, a deliberate burial that spoke of intention rather than accident. Williams called out to his coworkers, his voice cracking slightly. Within minutes, 6 men stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at the impossible sight. Someone whispered that it looked like a Packard, one of those old luxury cars that hadn't been made since the 50s. Castellano made the call to halt all operations immediately. He knew enough about Brooklyn's history to recognize when something demanded more than a foreman's judgment. The police arrived within the hour, followed by detectives from the NYPD's Cold Case Squad. Yellow tape went up around the site, transforming the demolition zone into a crime scene. News helicopters circled overhead by noon, their rotors beating a steady rhythm against the summer air. Reporters gathered at the perimeter. Cameras pointed at the hole in the ground where history had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to finally dig it up. No one yet knew whose history it was or how dark it would prove to be. The excavation proceeded with surgical precision over the following 3 days. Archaeologists from the city's forensic team joined the effort, their brushes and trowels replacing the excavator's brutal efficiency. The concrete chamber measured approximately 12 feet by 20 feet. Its walls poured thick and reinforced with rebar. Whoever had built it had intended it to last, to keep its contents hidden from the world indefinitely. The Packard emerged slowly from its tomb, a 1,956 patrician sedan in what had once been a lustrous hunter green. Its tires had long since deflated, its chrome pitted with corrosion, but its body remained remarkably intact, preserved by the cool, dry darkness of its underground prison. The moment the driver's side door was opened, the true nature of the discovery became horrifyingly clear. Slumped behind the steering wheel, still dressed in the remnants of what appeared to be a silk suit, were human skeletal remains. The skull showed obvious signs of trauma, 3 distinct holes above the left temple, the unmistakable signature of execution-style gunfire. A gold ring glinted on the skeletal right hand, its face engraved with initials that would soon unlock a mystery 64 years in the making. Detective Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who had seen more than her share of death, later admitted that the scene gave her chills unlike anything in her career. This was no ordinary cold case. This was a time capsule of murder. The forensic team documented everything with meticulous care. The victim's clothing, though deteriorated, revealed expensive tailoring hand-stitch seams, mother-of-pearl buttons, the faded label of a Manhattan haberdashery that had closed in 1971. A wristwatch remained on the left arm, an Omega Seamaster whose hands had frozen at 9:47, preserving the approximate moment of death like a final testimony. In the glove compartment, investigators found a wallet containing a New York driver's license, several business cards, and $87 in cash. The license bore a photograph of a stern-faced man with dark eyes and slicked-back hair. The name read Vincent Anthony Sorrentino. The address was in the Bronx. The Packard's trunk yielded additional evidence that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened in this underground tomb. $12,000 in cash, bundled in rubber bands that had long since disintegrated, lay scattered across the trunk's floor. A leather briefcase contained documents too deteriorated to read, along with a small notebook filled with handwritten entries, names, dates, dollar amounts. To the trained eye, it was clearly a gambling ledger, a record of debts owed and collected. There was also a .38 caliber revolver, fully loaded, unfired. Whoever had killed Vincent Sorrentino had not given him the chance to defend himself. He had been ambushed, executed, and entombed with the tools of his trade. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the NYPD had confirmed the victim's identity through dental records and DNA comparison with living relatives. Vincent Anthony Sorrentino, born the 12th of March 1914 in East Harlem, had been a captain in the Genovese crime family at the time of his disappearance. He had vanished on the 14th of June 1959, leaving behind a wife, 2 children, and a legacy of violence that had made him both feared and respected in the underworld. His disappearance had been investigated briefly by the FBI as part of a broader probe into organized crime, but the case had gone cold within months. For 64 years, Vincent Sorrentino had been listed as a missing person. Now, finally, he had been found. The news sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the diminished ranks of New York's aging mafiosi. A man who had been a ghost for more than 6 decades had suddenly become flesh and bone again, or at least what remained of it. Reporters scrambled to piece together his story, interviewing retired FBI agents and surviving family members, digging through newspaper archives and court records. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had lived and died by the brutal codes of the Cosa Nostra. A man whose fate had been sealed not by the law, but by the same criminal enterprise that had made him wealthy and powerful. Vincent Sorrentino had been betrayed, murdered, and erased from history. Until now, the discovery raised questions that would take months to fully investigate. Who had killed Vincent Sorrentino, and why? How had an entire automobile been buried beneath a building without anyone noticing or reporting it? What had the Packard meant to the victim, and what did its deliberate entombment signify? The answers, investigators would learn, lay buried not in concrete, but in the tangled history of organized crime in mid-century America. The year 1959 had been a turbulent time for the New York mob, a period of power struggles and paranoia in the aftermath of events that had exposed the underworld to unprecedented scrutiny. To understand Vincent Sorrentino's death, one had to understand the world in which he had lived. The warehouse on Atlantic Avenue had its own dark history, one that predated Sorrentino's murder by decades. Built in 1924, it had originally served as a distribution center for a legitimate textile company. But within 2 years of its construction, the building had been acquired by associates of the Luciano crime family, who converted its basement into a Prohibition-era speakeasy and bootlegging operation. Hidden rooms, false walls, and underground tunnels had been constructed to facilitate the illegal liquor trade. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the building returned to legitimate use, but its secrets remained intact beneath the floorboards. Someone had known about those hidden spaces. Someone had used them. The concrete chamber that entombed the Packard had been constructed with professional precision, suggesting the involvement of individuals with access to construction expertise and equipment. Investigators theorized that the burial had occurred within days of Sorrentino's disappearance, while the building was closed for what records described as structural repairs. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had planned this execution carefully, had chosen a location that would ensure the body remained hidden indefinitely. The killers had almost succeeded. If not for the building's demolition, Vincent Sorrentino might have remained entombed forever, his fate never known, his family never given closure. As news of the discovery spread, Anthony Sorrentino, the victim's 72-year-old son, stepped forward to speak with investigators. He had been 8 years old when his father disappeared, old enough to remember the man but too young to understand the world he inhabited. His mother, Rosa, had waited for her husband for years, refusing to accept that he was dead, clinging to the hope that he had simply fled to avoid prosecution and would someday return. She had died in 1998. Her hope unfulfilled, her questions unanswered. Now, finally, her son could provide the answers she had sought for 4 decades. His father was dead, his father had been murdered, and his father had been hidden, like a shameful secret, in the bowels of Brooklyn. The media descended upon the story with voracious appetite. Television networks aired special reports on the discovery, interviewing historians and former law enforcement officials who could provide context for the case. Newspapers published lengthy features exploring the history of the Genovese family and its role in organized crime during the 1,950 seconds. True crime podcasts recorded emergency episodes, their hosts breathlessly recounting the details of the excavation. The story had everything: a charismatic gangster, a luxury automobile, a decades-old mystery, and a resolution that seemed almost cinematic in its drama. Vincent Sorrentino, who had spent 64 years in obscurity, was suddenly famous in death. But beneath the media spectacle lay a human tragedy that no amount of sensationalism could obscure. A man had been murdered, his body hidden, his family left to wonder and grieve, without closure. Children had grown up without a father. A wife had spent her final years in agonizing uncertainty. The killers, whoever they were, had likely died themselves, escaping justice for their crime. The underworld that had created Vincent Sorrentino had also destroyed him, swallowing him whole and leaving not even a grave to mark his passing. Until that August morning, when a demolition crew's excavator struck metal instead of stone, and history finally surrendered one of its secrets. The investigation that followed would span months, and involve dozens of investigators, forensic specialists, and historians. Old FBI files were reopened, their contents examined with fresh eyes and new technology. Surviving witnesses, most of them in their 80s and 90s, were located and interviewed. The story that emerged was one of ambition and betrayal, of loyalty tested and found wanting, of a man who had risen through the ranks of organized crime only to be destroyed by the same forces that had elevated him. Vincent Sorrentino had been a player in a deadly game, and in the end, the game had claimed him. His Packard had become his coffin, Atlantic Avenue his unmarked grave. The discovery of the Packard, and its grim contents, represented more than the resolution of a single missing persons case. It was a window into a vanished world, a reminder of the violence that had once permeated the streets of New York, the organized crime families that had dominated the city in the 1,950 seconds still existed, but in diminished form, their power eroded by decades of federal prosecution and changing criminal economies. The men who had known Vincent Sorrentino, who had perhaps ordered or carried out his murder, were mostly dead themselves now. The secrets they had kept were dying with them. But some secrets, it seemed, refused to stay buried. Some secrets demanded, eventually, to be told. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. What happened in June 1959 involves New York's organized crime underworld at its most volatile moment. A powerful Genovese family captain who controlled territory worth millions, and a disappearance that remained unsolved despite FBI interest. The investigation will take us through the treacherous politics of the 5 families, the aftermath of the infamous Appalachian meeting, and a betrayal that cost a man his life. By the end, you will understand how Vincent Sorrentino and his Packard vanished from the streets of New York, why it took 64 years to find them, and who most likely ordered the hit that silenced him forever. Vincent Anthony Sorrentino was born on the 12th of March 1914 in a cramped tenement apartment on 116th Street in East Harlem, the heart of what was then known as Italian Harlem. He was the fourth of 7 children born to Giuseppe and Maria Sorrentino, immigrants from the province of Avellino in southern Italy, who had arrived in America in 1901. Giuseppe worked as a laborer on construction sites, earning barely enough to feed his growing family. Maria took in laundry and sewing to supplement their income. The Sorrentinos were poor, like most of their neighbors, but they were proud, clinging to the old country traditions that gave structure to their difficult lives. Vincent grew up speaking Italian before English, eating pasta e fagioli at a crowded kitchen table, learning early that survival required cunning as much as hard work. By the age of 14, Vincent had already developed the physical presence that would serve him throughout his criminal career. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed nearly 180 pounds, with broad shoulders and thick forearms inherited from his laborer father. His face was handsome in a rough way, with dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone he met. His hair was black, which he kept slicked back with pomade in the style of the era. Those who knew him described a young man of few words but considerable intelligence, someone who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything he heard. He was not educated. He had dropped out of school after the 8th grade, but he possessed a native shrewdness that more than compensated for his lack of formal learning. The nickname Vinny Cigars came from his habit of always having an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth, a affectation he had adopted as a teenager after seeing a photograph of Al Capone. He rarely smoked the cigars. They were props, symbols of the power and wealth he aspired to attain. In the Italian Harlem of the 1,920 and 1,930, power meant connections to the criminal organizations that dominated neighborhood life. Vincent made his first such connection at the age of 16, when he began running numbers for a local bookmaker affiliated with the Luciano crime family. He proved himself reliable, discreet, and surprisingly effective at collecting debts from reluctant gamblers. His reputation grew quickly in the cramped streets of East Harlem. His family lived modestly on the 5th floor of a building without an elevator, where the summer heat was suffocating and the winter cold seeped through every crack. Vincent's father died of a heart attack in 1932, leaving Maria to raise the remaining children on her own. Vincent, then 18, became the family's primary breadwinner, though his income came from sources his devout mother refused to acknowledge. He gave her money every week, bought his younger siblings clothes and shoes, paid for his sister's wedding when she married in 1936. He was a good son, a good brother, generous with those he loved. But there was another side to Vincent Sorrentino, a capacity for violence that he kept carefully controlled but readily available when circumstances demanded. His first known act of serious violence occurred in 1935, when he was 21 years old. A loan shark from a rival operation had been pressuring Italian families in East Harlem, threatening them with beatings if they failed to repay exorbitant debts. One of those families was the Costellos, whose daughter Vincent had been courting. When he learned that the loan shark had slapped Mrs. Costello across the face in front of her children, Vincent tracked the man to a bar on Pleasant Avenue. What happened next was never reported to police, but the loan shark was found the following morning in an alley, both his legs broken, his face beaten beyond recognition. He survived, but he never returned to East Harlem. Vincent Sorrentino had announced himself to the neighborhood, and to the men who controlled it. The Luciano organization took notice of the young man with the cigars and the heavy fists. By 1937, Vincent had been formally inducted into what would later become known as the Genovese crime family, having proven his loyalty and his usefulness through years of increasingly important work. He had graduated from running numbers to collecting debts, from collecting debts to overseeing gambling operations in Harlem and the South Bronx. His territory expanded steadily as older members retired or died, their operations absorbed into his growing portfolio. He earned well, invested wisely in legitimate businesses that served as fronts for his illegal activities, and cultivated relationships with corrupt police officers and politicians who could provide protection when needed. In 1940, At the age of 26, Vincent married Rosa Catalano, the daughter of a respected Bronx baker who had no connections to organized crime. Rosa was beautiful, devout, and utterly devoted to the man she believed was a successful businessman with interests in restaurants and nightclubs. She knew, on some level, that her husband's world was dangerous. She saw the men who came to their home for meetings, heard the guarded conversations that fell silent when she entered a room. But she chose not to ask questions, to accept the comfortable life Vincent provided without examining its foundations too closely. They moved into a handsome brownstone in the Belmont section of the Bronx, where their first child, Maria, was born in 1942, followed by Anthony in 1951. Vincent's criminal career flourished throughout the 1,940 and 1,950, surviving the upheavals that periodically shook the New York underworld. He remained loyal to Vito Genovese, even during the years when Genovese was in exile in Italy to avoid a murder charge. When Genovese returned to America in 1945 and began maneuvering to take control of the family from Frank Costello, Vincent was among his most reliable supporters. He provided muscle when muscle was needed, intelligence when intelligence was required, and money, always money, to fuel Genovese's ambitions. By 1957, Vincent Sorrentino had risen to the rank of captain, controlling gambling and loan sharking operations that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. He had become, by any measure, a successful criminal. The trappings of that success were everywhere evident in his life. He wore custom-tailored suits from a haberdashery on Madison Avenue, silk ties, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He drove the finest automobiles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, and finally, in 1956, the hunter green Packard patrician that would become his tomb. The Packard was special to him, a symbol of everything he had achieved. Packard had once been America's premier luxury automobile manufacturer, the choice of presidents and movie stars. Though the company was failing by 1956, its cars remained prestigious, and Vincent took pride in owning one of the last great Packards ever built. He drove it everywhere, kept it immaculately maintained, showed it off to anyone who would admire it. His home life presented a picture of domestic tranquility that belied the violence of his profession. He doted on his daughter Maria, spoiling her with expensive dresses and jewelry, attending her school plays and recitals whenever his schedule permitted. With young Anthony, he was more distant, as men of his generation often were with their sons. But there was love there nonetheless. He taught the boy to fish, took him to Yankees games, hoped secretly that his son would choose a different path than his own. Rosa maintained the household with quiet efficiency, hosting dinner parties for Vincent's associates, never acknowledging the nature of their work. They attended Mass every Sunday at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, where Vincent was a generous contributor to the building fund. But beneath the surface of respectability, Vincent Sorrentino inhabited a world of constant danger and shifting alliances. The late 1950s were a particularly treacherous time for the New York mob. In November 1957, a summit of organized crime leaders at the estate of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York, had been raided by state police, resulting in the arrest of more than 60 high-ranking mobsters. The disaster exposed the existence of a national crime syndicate to the American public and brought unprecedented heat from law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover, who had long denied the existence of the Mafia, could no longer maintain his pretense. The FBI began systematically investigating the 5 families, their members, and their operations. For men like Vincent Sorrentino, the comfortable old ways were suddenly precarious. The aftermath of Appalachian created internal tensions within the Genovese family that would prove fatal for some. Vito Genovese himself became the target of a federal investigation that culminated in his arrest on narcotics charges in July 1958. Rumors circulated that rival bosses, possibly Carlo Gambino and Meyer Lansky, had orchestrated the case by paying a Puerto Rican drug dealer named Nelson Cantalopes to give false testimony. Whether the rumors were true or not, Genovese was convicted in April 1959 and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His incarceration created a power vacuum in the family, with various factions jockeying for control. Vincent Sorrentino, as a known Genovese loyalist, found himself in an increasingly dangerous position. The months leading up to Vincent's disappearance were marked by unusual behavior that his family noticed but did not fully understand. He became more secretive, more cautious, checking the street before leaving his home, varying his routes to avoid predictability. He spent long hours away from home, returning late at night with a tension in his shoulders that Rosa had never seen before. He made his daughter promise to take care of her mother if anything ever happened to him. A conversation that Maria, then 17, found deeply disturbing. He increased his life insurance, paid off the mortgage on the brownstone, made sure Rosa knew where the family's savings were kept. He was, though no one recognized it at the time, putting his affairs in order. On the morning of the 14th of June, 1959, Vincent Sorrentino kissed his wife goodbye, tousled his 8-year-old son's hair, and drove his beloved Packard out of the Bronx toward Brooklyn. He told Rosa he had a meeting with business associates and would be home for dinner. He was wearing a gray silk suit, a burgundy tie, and his favorite gold cufflinks. His Omega watch showed 10:15 when he pulled away from the curb. A neighbor, Mrs. Della Croce, saw him go and waved. Vincent waved back, smiling slightly, the unlit cigar clenched between his teeth, as always. It was the last time anyone outside the underworld would see him alive. By evening, when he failed to return home, Rosa's worry had curdled into something closer to dread. She waited 3 days before contacting the police, hoping against hope that her husband would walk through the door with some reasonable explanation. He had disappeared before, briefly, on business that he never explained, but always returned within a day or two. When 72 hours passed with no word, no call, no sign of the green Packard, Rosa finally made the call that would officially begin the search for Vincent Sorrentino. The police took her report with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. They knew who Vincent Sorrentino was, knew what he did for a living. Men like him disappeared for reasons that rarely had innocent explanations. Either he had fled to avoid prosecution, or he had been killed by his own kind. Either way, it was unlikely they would ever find him. The FBI took a greater interest in the case, viewing Sorrentino's disappearance as potentially useful intelligence about internal conflicts within the Genovese family. Agents interviewed known associates, surveilled suspected meeting places, cultivated informants who might know what had happened to the missing captain. The investigation continued for approximately 6 months before it, too, went cold. No body was found, no credible witnesses came forward, and the wall of omerta, the code of silence that bound members of the Mafia, proved impenetrable. The official file on Vincent Sorrentino was never formally closed, but by 1960, it had effectively ceased to be an active investigation. He was simply gone. One more victim of a violent world that rarely yielded its secrets. Rosa Sorrentino spent the next 4 decades in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn a husband who might still be alive, unable to move forward with a life built on uncertainty. She never remarried, never even dated, maintaining an almost religious fidelity to a man who might have abandoned her. She raised their children alone, supported by money Vincent had left, and by the quiet assistance of men from his old organization who remembered her husband with respect. Maria married young, moved to New Jersey, had children of her own. Anthony struggled more, dropping out of college, drifting through a series of jobs, never quite finding his footing. The shadow of his father's disappearance hung over him throughout his life. The Bronx brownstone, where the Sorrentinos had lived, became a kind of shrine to the missing patriarch. Rosa kept his clothes in the closet, his books on the shelves, his armchair in its usual spot by the living room window. On their wedding anniversary each year, she set a place for him at the dinner table. When friends and family suggested gently that it was time to accept the obvious truth that Vincent was dead, had been dead for years, she refused to listen. Hope was all she had left, and she clung to it with desperate tenacity. She died in 1998, at the age of 81, still waiting for her husband to come home. The death certificate listed her cause of death as heart failure, but her children knew better. Rosa Sorrentino had died of hope deferred too long. The decades that passed between Vincent's disappearance and the discovery of his remains saw dramatic changes in both New York City and the criminal underworld that had shaped his life. The old neighborhood of Italian Harlem transformed beyond recognition, its ethnic character diluted by waves of migration and gentrification. The five families persisted but diminished, their power eroded by RICO prosecutions, the defection of high-ranking members to witness protection, and the rise of competing criminal organizations. The men who had known Vincent Sorrentino, his friends, his rivals, his killers aged and died, taking their secrets with them. By 2023, the world he had inhabited seemed almost unimaginably distant, a sepia-toned memory of fedoras and Tommy guns. The building on Atlantic Avenue that housed his secret grave underwent its own transformations during those years. After the war, it had been purchased by a furniture wholesaler who used it as a warehouse and showroom. The basement, with its hidden rooms and buried automobile, remained undisturbed beneath the legitimate commerce conducted above. Successive owners came and went, none aware of what lay beneath their feet. The building changed hands 5 times between 1959 and 2020, when it was finally acquired by a real estate development company that intended to demolish it and build luxury condominiums. The condemned structure sat empty for 3 years, while permits were obtained and financing secured. All that time, Vincent Sorrentino waited in the darkness below. The neighborhood around Atlantic Avenue changed dramatically during those 6 decades. What had once been a working-class industrial district transformed into a gentrified enclave of boutiques, restaurants, and million-dollar brownstones. Young professionals walked their dogs past buildings where bootleggers had once counted their profits and gangsters had settled their disputes with bullets. The old speakeasies became craft cocktail bars, the warehouses became loft apartments, and the memory of organized crime faded into romanticized nostalgia. Nobody walking those tree-lined streets in 2023 would have guessed that beneath the surface of their fashionable neighborhood, a murdered mobster sat in his Packard, waiting to be discovered. The physical evidence of New York's mob history had largely disappeared by the 21st century. The barbershop, where Albert Anastasia was murdered, had been demolished. The restaurant where Joey Gallo was shot had closed decades ago. The social clubs where made men had gathered to conduct business had been converted into yoga studios and organic grocery stores. Only in the memories of aging men and in the pages of history books did the old underworld survive. Vincent Sorrentino's concrete tomb was a rare exception, a physical remnant of an era that most New Yorkers preferred to forget. Its discovery would force the city to remember, at least briefly, the violence that had once defined its streets. The legal framework for prosecuting organized crime had evolved dramatically since Sorrentino's death. The RICO Act of 1970 had given federal prosecutors powerful new tools to dismantle criminal enterprises, leading to the conviction of dozens of high-ranking mobsters throughout the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. Bosses who had once seemed untouchable, John Gotti, Vincent Gigante, Carmine Persico, had been sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, had been effectively dismantled. By 2023, the 5 families still existed, but as shadows of their former selves, their influence limited, their membership aging. The world that had created and destroyed Vincent Sorrentino had itself been largely destroyed by the law. Historians and criminologists viewed the Sorrentino discovery as a significant archaeological find, a window into the operational methods of mid-century organized crime. The elaborate burial, the choice of location, the professional execution all spoke to the sophistication and ruthlessness of the 1950 seconds Mafia. Academic papers were written analyzing the case, comparing it to other known mob killings, drawing conclusions about the internal politics of the Genovese family during the tumultuous post-Appalachian period. Vincent Sorrentino, who had spent his life avoiding attention, became the subject of scholarly attention and death, his murder examined and dissected by researchers who had never known his world. The investigation into Sorrentino's murder proceeded on multiple fronts following the discovery of his remains. Forensic specialists analyzed the skeletal remains, confirming through dental records and DNA that the victim was indeed the missing mobster. The 3 bullet holes in the skull indicated a professional execution, likely carried out with a small caliber handgun at close range. The positioning of the body seated upright in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel, suggested that he had been killed elsewhere and then placed in the vehicle before burial. The concrete chamber showed evidence of being constructed quickly but competently, probably by workers who knew how to keep secrets. The killers had been thorough in their efforts to ensure Vincent Sorrentino would never be found. Old FBI files, declassified and re-examined, provided crucial context for understanding the murder. Agents in 1959 had developed several theories about Sorrentino's disappearance, most centering on internal Genovese family politics. One theory held that Sorrentino had been killed by rivals who resented his closeness to the imprisoned Vito Genovese and feared he might attempt to maintain the boss's influence from outside the prison walls. Another suggested that Sorrentino himself had been suspected of disloyalty, perhaps of providing information to federal investigators in exchange for leniency on potential charges. A third theory proposed that the murder was connected to a disputed gambling territory in Harlem, a conflict that had been simmering for months before his disappearance. The most compelling evidence pointed toward the first theory, that Vincent Sorrentino had been killed as part of the power struggle that followed Vito Genovese's imprisonment. In the months after Genovese's conviction, several of his known loyalists had been murdered or had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Anthony Strollo, known as Tony Bender, who had served as Genovese's acting boss, would himself vanish without a trace in 1962. The pattern suggested a systematic purge of the Genovese faction by rivals who saw an opportunity to seize control of the family. Sorrentino, with his reputation for loyalty and his control of lucrative territories, would have been a logical target for such a purge. The investigation identified several suspects, all of them long dead by 2023. The most likely candidate was a Genovese captain named Carmine Persico, not to be confused with the Colombo boss of the same name who had emerged as a rival to Sorrentino in the late 1950s. Persico had allegedly coveted Sorrentino's Bronx territories and had the connections necessary to arrange both the murder and its elaborate concealment. The warehouse on Atlantic Avenue had been owned, investigators discovered, by a shell company with ties to Persico's operation. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. But Persico had died of natural causes in 1987, and with him died any possibility of prosecution for Vincent Sorrentino's murder. The methodology of the murder and burial revealed the cold professionalism of mid-century organized crime. Sorrentino had likely been lured to a meeting in Brooklyn on the 14th of June 1959, perhaps told that the gathering would address the family's leadership crisis. He had driven his Packard to the meeting location, parking in a garage or enclosed space where witnesses would be absent. There, he had been confronted by his killers, probably men he knew, possibly even men he trusted. The 3 shots to the head had been delivered quickly, efficiently, without giving him time to reach the loaded revolver in his briefcase. His body had been left in the driver's seat, perhaps as a message, perhaps simply as the easiest way to move it. The construction of the underground tomb must have begun almost immediately after the murder. Workers, likely brought in from outside the city to ensure their silence, had excavated a chamber beneath the warehouse's basement floor. The Packard, with its gruesome cargo, had been lowered or driven into the pit. Concrete had been poured to seal the chamber, creating a vault that was virtually undetectable from above. The work had probably been completed within a week, perhaps less. By the time Rosa Sorrentino reported her husband missing, his grave was already set, his Packard already entombed, his fate already sealed. The killers had planned well, and their plan had nearly succeeded. The $12,000 found in the Packard's trunk raised intriguing questions about the circumstances of the murder. Had Sorrentino been carrying the money to the meeting as payment for something, or had he collected it earlier that day from his gambling operations? The presence of the cash suggested that robbery had not been the motive. A significant sum had been left behind, apparently irrelevant to the killer's purposes. The gambling ledger in the briefcase was equally puzzling. Had Sorrentino been killed to prevent him from collecting certain debts, or to obtain information contained in the ledger? The questions multiplied with each new piece of evidence, painting a picture of complexity that decades of investigation had done nothing to clarify. The Omega watch frozen at 9:47 provided investigators with an approximate time of death, assuming the watch had stopped from the trauma of the shooting or from subsequent deterioration. If the murder had occurred at 9:47 inches the evening, Sorrentino had been alive for nearly 12 hours after leaving his home that morning. Where had he been during those hours? Who had he seen? What had he done? The FBI's 1,959 investigation had attempted to trace his movements on his final day, interviewing bartenders, restaurateurs, and known associates, but the trail had gone cold almost immediately. Sorrentino had entered the underworld's shadows, and the shadows had kept their secrets. The passage of time had erased many of the witnesses and much of the evidence that might have conclusively solved the case. Buildings had been demolished, records had been destroyed, memories had faded or been distorted by the decades. The old mobsters who had known Sorrentino, the ones who might have talked in their final years, seeking to unburden their consciences or settle old scores, had mostly taken their knowledge to their graves. A few aging survivors were located and interviewed, men in their 80s and 90s whose recollections were fragmentary and often contradictory. They remembered Vinny's cigars, remembered him fondly in some cases, but they could not, or would not, say what had happened to him. Omerta, it seemed, persisted even in the shadow of death. One breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The personal papers of a deceased FBI agent named Harold Morrison, who had worked organized crime cases in New York throughout the 1,960 seconds. Morrison had died in 2015, and his daughter, while going through his effects, had discovered boxes of notes and documents related to his investigations. Among them was a file on the Sorrentino disappearance containing Morrison's handwritten theory of the case. He believed that Sorrentino had been killed on the orders of Tommy Eboli, who would later serve as acting boss of the Genovese family, as part of a coordinated effort to eliminate Vito Genovese's power base. Morrison had never been able to prove his theory, but his analysis was remarkably consistent with the evidence discovered 60 years later. The forensic examination of the Packard itself yielded additional insights. The vehicle identification number confirmed it as a 1,956 Patrician, originally sold by a dealer in Manhattan in March of that year. Registration records showed it had been purchased by Vincent Sorrentino for cash, a transaction that had required no financing and left minimal paper trail. The car's condition, despite 64 years of entombment, was remarkably good. The dry, cool environment of the concrete chamber had slowed deterioration, preserving paint, upholstery, and mechanical components that would normally have rusted away to nothing. Automotive historians noted that the Packard was a rare survivor of a brief production run, potentially valuable to collectors if not for its grim provenance. The discovery attracted attention from documentary filmmakers, true crime authors, and organized crime historians eager to tell the story of Vincent Sorrentino. His son Anthony, now 72 years old, granted several interviews in which he spoke movingly about growing up in the shadow of his father's disappearance. He described the uncertainty that had poisoned his childhood, the whispered speculations he had overheard at family gatherings, the gradual realization as he matured that his father had been a criminal and had almost certainly died violently. Learning the truth after 64 years was painful, he admitted, but it was also a relief. At least now he knew. At least now he could mourn properly, could visit a grave, could speak his father's name without the ambiguity that had surrounded it for so long. Maria Sorrentino de Luca, Vincent's daughter, was more reluctant to speak publicly about the discovery. Now, 75 years old, she had built a life deliberately distanced from her father's world, raised her children in suburban New Jersey without telling them the details of their grandfather's profession. The sudden publicity surrounding the case had disrupted that carefully maintained separation, forcing her to confront a past she had tried to leave behind. In a brief statement issued through a family attorney, she asked that the media respect her privacy and allow her to process the news in peace. She had waited a lifetime to learn her father's fate. She deserved time to make sense of what that fate had been. The funeral for Vincent Sorrentino took place on the 12th of September 2023 at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church in the Bronx, the same church where he had been a parishioner more than 6 decades earlier. His remains, released by the medical examiner after the completion of forensic analysis, were interred in a plot beside his wife Rosa at St. Raymond's Cemetery. The service was attended by approximately 50 people, including family members, curious onlookers, and a handful of reporters who maintained a respectful distance. Father Michael Colantuono, who presided over the Mass, spoke of redemption and the mysterious ways of divine providence. Whatever sins Vincent Sorrentino had committed in life, he suggested, he had suffered for them in the lonely darkness of his tomb. The Packard patrician, cleaned and preserved, was donated to the Museum of the City of New York, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibit on organized crime in mid-century America. Visitors could view the vehicle through glass, read placards explaining its history, watch video footage of the excavation that had brought it back to the surface. The exhibit proved enormously popular, drawing crowds who wanted to glimpse a tangible artifact of a legendary era. The car that had once been Vincent Sorrentino's pride and joy had become, in death, a monument to the world that had created and destroyed him. Its gleaming green finish, restored by careful conservators, looked much as it had on that June morning in 1959, when Sorrentino had driven it out of the Bronx for the last time. The investigation into Sorrentino's murder was officially closed in December 2023, with investigators acknowledging that too much time had passed to bring anyone to justice. All of the likely perpetrators were dead, witnesses were unavailable or unreliable, and the evidence, while compelling, was insufficient to support prosecution even if a living suspect could be identified. The case would remain on the books as solved but unprosecuted, a status that satisfied no one but reflected the reality of investigating crimes committed more than half a century ago. Vincent Sorrentino had been murdered by the Mafia, probably by rivals within his own organization, and his killers had escaped earthly punishment. Only history could judge them now. The legacy of the discovery extended beyond the resolution of a single cold case. It prompted renewed interest in other missing persons from the same era, other victims of organized crime who had simply vanished and never been found. Investigators began re-examining old files, looking for patterns that might suggest where other bodies lay buried. Aging buildings throughout the 5 boroughs were viewed with new suspicion, their basements and foundations potential tombs for the forgotten dead. The Sorrentino case had demonstrated that the past could resurface unexpectedly, that secrets buried for generations could still be uncovered. It was a lesson with implications far beyond this one murder. For the Sorrentino family, the discovery brought a painful closure that was nonetheless better than the endless uncertainty they had endured. Anthony visited his father's grave regularly in the months following the funeral, speaking to the headstone as if his father could hear him, sharing news of grandchildren Vincent had never known, asking questions that would never be answered. He told reporters that he felt his mother's spirit was finally at peace, reunited with the husband she had never stopped loving, free from the doubt that had tormented her final decades. Whether that was true or merely a comforting fantasy, it helped him make sense of a tragedy that had shaped his entire life. Some wounds never fully heal, but at least now this one could begin to scar over. The children and grandchildren of Vincent Sorrentino would carry his legacy into future generations, though in forms he could never have imagined. His granddaughter, a law school professor in Boston, wrote an essay about learning her family's true history, exploring questions of identity and inheritance when one's ancestors were criminals. A great-grandson, fascinated by the story, was working on a documentary that would examine not just Vincent's life and death, but the broader world of Italian-American organized crime and its complicated cultural legacy. The Sorrentino name, once whispered in fear on the streets of the Bronx, had become something else entirely, a subject of academic study, a footnote in history books, a story to be told and retold. The story of Vincent Sorrentino became a cautionary tale about the wages of a life in organized crime. He had achieved wealth, power, respect within his world, all the things young men from Italian Harlem dreamed of achieving. But those achievements had been built on violence and exploitation, on a foundation that could collapse without warning. In the end, the same underworld that had elevated him had destroyed him, leaving his body to rot in darkness while his family suffered above. The Packard that had symbolized his success became the vehicle of his concealment. The beautiful car transformed into a coffin. There was a grim poetry in that irony, a lesson about the impermanence of ill-gotten gains. As the months passed and public attention moved on to other stories, the warehouse site on Atlantic Avenue was finally cleared for development. The luxury condominiums that would rise in its place would bear no marker, no memorial to what had been found beneath the old building's floor. Future residents would live their lives unaware that a murdered mobster had spent 64 years entombed beneath them. The city moved on, as cities always do, burying its past beneath layers of new construction and new stories. But somewhere in the archives, in police files and newspaper clippings and documentary footage, the story of Vincent Sorrentino would persist. He had been forgotten for more than 6 decades. He would not be forgotten again. The detectives and forensic specialists who had worked the case would remember it as one of the strangest and most compelling of their careers. Detective Maria Santos, who had led the investigation, gave lectures at police academies about the challenges of investigating cold cases and the importance of preserving evidence across generations. She kept a photograph of the Packard emerging from its concrete tomb on her office wall, a reminder that even the most carefully hidden crimes can eventually come to light. The past, she told her students, is never really past. It waits for us, patient and persistent, ready to demand attention when we least expect it. The Sorrentino case was proof of that truth. The organized crime families of New York, diminished but not destroyed, took note of the discovery with a mixture of fascination and unease. The old ways of disposing of problems, the burial sites, the weighted bodies in rivers, the unmarked graves in remote locations, had always seemed permanent solutions to temporary difficulties. The Sorrentino case demonstrated that permanence was an illusion. Buildings came down, landscapes changed, and secrets that seemed safely buried could resurface at any time. For those who still operated in the shadows, it was a sobering reminder that the past could reach forward to expose them, even decades after they thought their crimes had been safely concealed. The younger generation of law enforcement officers, many of whom had grown up watching mob movies and television shows, found the Sorrentino case both fascinating and instructive. Here was tangible proof that the stories their predecessors had told were not exaggerations, that the violence of the old mafia had been real and brutal and often permanent. Training academies used the case as a teaching tool, illustrating both the methods of organized crime and the patience sometimes required to solve cold cases. Forensic science instructors pointed to the physical evidence as examples of what could survive decades of burial and what could still be learned from seemingly hopeless circumstances. The case also sparked renewed public interest in the history of organized crime in New York. Book publishers reported increased sales of mob-related titles, and streaming services noted higher viewership for documentaries about the 5 families. Walking tours of former Mafia sites in Manhattan and Brooklyn saw their attendance numbers rise. There was something about the Sorrentino story, the luxury car, the hidden tomb, the 64 years of mystery that captured the public imagination in ways that more recent crimes could not. It was history come alive, a tangible connection to an era that seemed both impossibly distant and strangely compelling. Local residents of Atlantic Avenue had mixed reactions to the discovery beneath their neighborhood. Some expressed horror at learning they had lived and worked above a murder victim for years without knowing it. Others saw the story as evidence of their neighborhood's colorful history, a dark chapter that somehow added character to the area. Real estate agents worried briefly about property values, but the concern proved unfounded. If anything, the notoriety seemed to attract curious buyers willing to pay premium prices for apartments with a story. The luxury condominiums that eventually rose on the site sold quickly, their residents either unaware of or unbothered by what had once been buried there. In the final analysis, the story of Vincent Sorrentino was both uniquely dramatic and depressingly common. He was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of organized crime figures who vanished during the bloody decades of the mid-20th century. Most of those men were never found, their fates unknown, their families left to wonder forever what had become of them. Sorrentino was exceptional only because his tomb was discovered, his remains identified, his story finally told. The others remain out there somewhere in landfills and waterways, in the foundations of buildings, in the deep places of the earth where secrets go to die. Their stories will likely never be known. Their families will never receive the closure that the Sorrentinos finally achieved. The 14th of August 2023 had begun as an ordinary summer day in Brooklyn, humid and gray, undistinguished from countless days before it. But by its end, it had become a day that would be remembered, written about, discussed for years to come. A demolition crew had set out to tear down an old building and had instead uncovered a chapter of history that the city had long since forgotten. Vincent Sorrentino, dead for 64 years, had finally emerged from the darkness to tell his story, or at least to allow others to tell it for him. The green Packard that had carried him to his death had also carried him back to the world of the living, a ghost ship returning from an underground sea. The Packard itself, that symbol of mid-century American luxury, had become inseparable from Sorrentino's story. It was the last thing he had owned, the last place he had sat, the vessel that had carried him into darkness for more than 6 decades. Packard had ceased to exist as a company in 1958, just a year before Sorrentino's death, making his patrician one of the final examples of a dying breed. There was poetry in that coincidence, the end of 2 eras intertwined beneath the streets of Brooklyn. The car that had represented his success had become the instrument of his concealment. Its sealed cabin, preserving his remains like a pharaoh's tomb preserving a king. Rest in peace, Vincent Anthony Sorrentino. Your long wait in the darkness is over. Your wife Rosa, who never stopped hoping, finally knows what happened to you. Your children, who grew up in the shadow of your absence, can now speak your name without ambiguity. The Packard that was your pride is preserved for history, a reminder of who you were and the world you inhabited. You were not a good man by conventional measures, and you died as you lived, by violence and betrayal. But you were also a father, a husband, a son of immigrants who sought a better life in a new country. You are finally at rest, finally at peace, finally home. And your story, hidden for 64 years beneath the streets of Brooklyn, has finally been told.